Alrighty. So we've reached the half-hour mark, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to this week's installment of the AMSSM's National Fellow Online Lecture Series. This is the first lecture of the 2025-2026 academic year. My name is Haruki Ishii, one of the sports medicine physiatrists at the New York University. I'll be your moderator for tonight. This lecture series is sponsored by the AMSSM Fellow Online Education Subcommittee, co-sponsored by the Education Committee and the Fellowship Committee. Tonight, we'll be discussing heat illness. And before we get into our topic for tonight, I want to remind everyone of next week's lecture on sudden cardiac arrest, which will be given by Dr. David Siebert and moderated by Dr. James Robinson next week at 8:30 Eastern Time. The goals of this National Fellow Online Lecture Series is to serve as an adjunct to your individual fellowship program education and to provide sports medicine fellows with direct access to learning from experienced AMSSM members and guest speakers in a variety of formats. Also, this is meant to assist in CAQ exam preparation. Some housekeeping items. So please mute your device's microphone and turn off your video. You can submit questions at any time through the chat function, and feel free to include your name and program if you wish. At the end of the talk, I, as a moderator, will ask the questions during the Q&A based on the questions submitted. Please also complete the evaluation at the end of the lecture. We will love your feedback. So one of our new efforts is to facilitate more input from our audience, and there are a couple ways to do this. So first, the web link can be found by going to amssm.org, click the Education tab, and then select Fellow Online Lecture Series. The link is near the top of the page as seen in this screenshot. The second is by scanning this QR code. It should take you directly to the form to fill out. When filling out the form, we ask that you please keep in mind that the primary goal of this series is to assist in CAQ preparation for fellows. And now I'd like to introduce you to our expert speaker tonight, Dr. Douglas Casa. Dr. Casa is the CEO of Corey Stringer Institute since it was founded in 2010, and is a Board of Trustee Distinguished Professor of Kinesiology at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Casa was inducted into the NADA Hall of Fame in June 2024. The mission of the KSI is to provide research, education, advocacy, and consultation to maximize performance, optimize safety, and prevent sudden death for the athlete, warfighter, and laborer. Additionally, he's the editor of a book titled Preventing Sudden Death in Sport and Physical Activity, second edition published in 2017 by Jones and Bartlett in cooperation with the American College of Sports Medicine. Another recent book titled Sports and Physical Activity in the Heat, Maximizing Performance and Safety was published by Springer in the winter of 2018. His latest book, Elite Soccer Players, Maximizing Performance and Safety, was published by Routledge in 2020. Dr. Casa has published about 400 peer-reviewed publications, book chapters, and presented more than 700 times on subjects related to maximizing performance in the heat, exertional heat stroke, heat-related illnesses, preventing sudden death in sport, and hydration. He has an age index of 69. As a licensed athletic trainer, Dr. Casa has successfully treated 405 cases of exertional heat stroke with 0 fatalities. In addition, from 2018 through 2021, he served on the International Olympic Committee Adverse Weather Impact Expert Group for the Olympic Games in Tokyo 2020, which took place in 2021, that focused on the extreme heat anticipated for these games. Now, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Casa.
Excellent. All right, so huge honor to be here. I've spoken at your national meeting a few times in my career in the past, have great respect for AMSSM and the bridge that especially athletic trainers have with AMSSM physicians, and done a lot of work with a lot of your physicians through the years. I just want to also tell you, so I don't forget, that my normal heat stroke talk that I give throughout the year to physicians at med schools or in sports medicine athletic programs to physicians and athletic trainers is a 3-hour talk. It's 2 hours of lecture and an hour of lab. So I did a consolidated 45-minute version for you here today. So I will share PDFs after the talk so they can be additional resources for you, but I obviously can't go in the same kind of depth that I normally do. I also even have a semester-long class at UConn, specifically titled Exertional Heat Stroke. So we have a 15-week class just on this one topic. So we obviously can do deeper dives, but I'm hoping that this gives you at least a glimpse of the current best practices related to exertional heat stroke. On any talk I give, I have to just say the University of Connecticut requires our disclosures. Those are our 9 corporate partners for the Corey Stringer Institute, and then the bottom right are different places in which we additionally earn income. I just want to give you a little bit of personal background about me. I've been a professor at UConn for the last 26 years. I do kid around with people that in 1993, when I arrived, they had 0 national titles in basketball, and now we have 18 national championships between men and women's basketball. So I do think that is more than a coincidence. But anyway, so it's been a really good run. We've had a great opportunity. I'll talk more about the work we do at the Corey Stringer Institute here at UConn. Some of these things were mentioned already, so I'm not going to spend more time, but I want you to just get an idea that we try to constantly publish cutting edge research. We provide a lot of actual clinical care on site. I've personally dealt with heat strokes in 8 different sports. But also, I'm an expert witness on 80 cases, about 40 in the labor space, 40 in the athletic space. And during those cases, you do learn a lot because obviously, if things become lawsuits, then obviously something has gone wrong. Person has passed away, or they have permanent complications related to the exertional heat stroke, and hence the lawsuit. But at the top, you'll also notice it says really for. That's because when I was 16 years old, I suffered an exertional heat stroke on August 8th, 1985. Ironically, 2 days from now will be the 40th anniversary of that event. I was running a 10K race on the track in the Empire State Games, which is a summer Olympic festival that had been held in New York for like 40 years. And collapsed on the final lap with 200 meters to go, got up, ran the turn, and collapsed again with 50 meters to go, and then was unconscious for the next few hours. So that definitely shaped every single thing I've done in the 40 years since. And that's a little bit of my background there. The mission of the Corey Stringer Institute was already read, and I do want to emphasize that a huge chunk, more than half of what we do, is related to performance in the heat, not just obviously deal things with heat stroke. So we do a lot with just finding ways for athletes, warfighters, and laborers to do better when they have to do their job or their sport in the heat. We have a lot of components in KSI. We have 102 employees at KSI, 30 staff, and 72 volunteers. So there's research components, education, advocacy and policy changes, consultation, outreach. So we'll get into some of those today. I always have this in every single talk I give. That's Ken Scriber. That's the athletic trainer who started my care to save my life 40 years ago. I found out 16 years after the heat stroke that he was the athletic trainer who cared for me that day. So very special, and I always include that. Some of the work we do at KSI I mentioned is related to laborers. We're the heat mitigation provider for UPS, for Delta Airlines, work closely with the union that services the US Postal Service and a lot of other companies. So we have contact with over 1 million workers who are working in the heat every single day. But that's just an example of some of the companies. So it's a big avenue of what we do is the laborer space. But we also do a ton with the military. We've had 18 Department of Defense grants in the last 6 years. So a ton of things related to wearable technologies, heat acclimatization, body cooling, hydration, supplements, medications, things like that. So that's where a lot of our publications come from, that work. We do our work. If you've never been in an environmental heat lab before, if you're ever near UConn, certainly come visit us. We have this one heat lab here, and it can go from -20 up to 120, humidity from 20 to 90%. It can go full sun to full cloud with radiant heat lamps and 0 to 20 mile an hour wind. So we basically can recreate any environmental conditions that we'd want to test for an athlete, warfighter, or a laborer. We're very fortunate that our president approved a new $1 million heat lab. So we'll have 2 state-of-the-art heat labs. And this is a bigger space for us, a bigger footprint, but this also has altitude up to 12,000 feet. So we can study heat and altitude together, which would be one of the first facilities in the world that can do that. But also excitingly, and is especially for people looking for collaboration with KSI, we're opening our first satellite heat lab in Jacksonville, Florida, at the University of North Florida. And the professors actually are starting there in 10 days, 2 new KSI professors there. And the new heat lab is opening in January. So this facility you see here is about to be built. And the KSI is super fortunate that the university is including it in this new academic and athletic facility. So these books were mentioned just now, some of the work that we've done recently. The one on the left is the most relevant to this talk here today. And it has about 20 chapters, each written by world experts on that specific subchapter, like heat act, body cooling, environmental monitoring, things like that. Just to give you a little bit quick backstory of some of the work we do, like just to give you a snapshot if you don't know much about the Corey Stringer Institute, Heading into the Tokyo Olympics, which you know was 2021, the U.S. women's national team spent 2 weeks with us before they headed off to Tokyo. So they did their normal practice in the morning, but then they did a heat act session every afternoon or evening. And we did that for a couple weeks so that when it arrived in Tokyo, their heat acclimatization would be complete. That's just one example. We assisted FIFA getting ready for the World Cup in Qatar, but we also assisted the World Track and Field Championships, which were in Doha in 2019. So did a lot of work related to that, especially with the marathon that were held at midnight and on a 7K loop, and a lot getting the medical staff ready for that. So that's just an example of another entities in sports that we've assisted. We also have publications that come from all these experiences, and I'll show different ones if they can be useful to you. This is an example of our preparation for the World Championships for track and field. This will be super relevant in just a few weeks from now, because many of you may know Tokyo is hosting the World Championships for track and field in the middle of September. I will be there actually presenting at some sports medicine meetings there, but obviously could be very, very, very hot in Tokyo in the middle of September. As mentioned earlier, we assisted the International Olympic Committee to get ready for the Tokyo Olympics. International Olympic Committee, I give them a ton of credit. They were very flexible, even moved where the marathon was. Normally it finishes in the Olympic Stadium. They moved it up to Sapporo, which was about 6 hours north of Tokyo because it's a cooler city. They were also very flexible with when the events would take place to try to really focus in on certain events that would be greater risk and putting them in less risky times. So this is just giving an example. If you know wet bulb globe temperature much, the average temperatures in Tokyo on the days the Olympics were taking place was, just to give you an idea, like 33 degrees, which would be black flag in the military, which would cancel all training, just to give you an idea. And that's just normal average temperatures in Tokyo. So I mentioned some of the stuff with Tokyo. I'm not going to spend a ton of time there. One of the publications from Tokyo is this one listed here. And again, I'll share all of these with you, with the person who's running this Zoom that we're doing right now. But I have some other really good ones from the IOC that resulted from our efforts with the Tokyo Olympics that I'll share with you in a couple minutes. As you guys all know, and I'd really encourage you to try to get involved with medical care, America has 11 host cities next summer for the World Cup. There's also 3 in Mexico and 2 in Canada. So if you're able to get the experience of doing this, the teams themselves will have training locations near these cities. So we're going to have like literally, I forget what it is next year. Is it the first time it's going to 48 teams, I think? So there'll be a lot of opportunities near where you are. So to kind of get into the meat of some of the stuff here today, I'm 56 years old, and just in my tiny lifespan, in the span of like human history on Earth, the heat wave frequency has tripled, if you could imagine, in just 56 years. Okay, so from the 60s to the last decade, we have full data on. That's like astronomical when you consider that is such a short period of time. And the heat season has actually tripled in the same time period. And the duration of heat waves has gone up by a day as well. So all of these stresses, I heard a stat recently that someone born in like 1985 and forward, it's the Earth has been hotter every single day since then. I mean, every single year since then. We do things sometimes just to kind of give perspective for people from a historical perspective. We published some papers looking at how people have treated heat stroke over the last like 3,000 years. And I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I do find it interesting that one of the common ways was bloodletting, which is opening up like a vein or an artery and letting blood drain out of your body because they thought that would release heat from the body. As you know, that would be really bad for someone who's already dehydrated, and it wasn't successful. So they moved on to friction massages, which is sandpapering the entire body, so that blood would ooze out more slowly because they thought the heat needed to be released slowly. And again, that wasn't super successful. But I think it's good to get perspective because you see this quote from 1895, 130 years ago. Someone talked about having to use ice and water, treating the person on site and using a rectal thermometer to get body temperature. That was 130 years ago. And I can tell you right now, today, we're still working to try to get this to be the care that everyone's utilizing when they're expecting heat strokes in the venue in which they're working. A couple educational resources I just want to make sure you're aware of. This was a 4-minute TED Ed video. If you just Google what happens when you get heat stroke or my name and heat stroke, it's really good overview of what happens for treatment. This is very popular to be used with parents and coaches during orientation meetings for high schools. But it would be a great resource for different people that you interact with. Ted had made it and very classy. The NFL spent 150,000 on this video. It's a 12-minute meant for physicians and athletic trainers, but at the high school level, we always recommend sending it, sharing it with coaches and athletic directors as well. And the reason for that is if you're a high school athletic trainer and a heat stroke happens, you have to have other people assist you because if it's a 250-pound person, you're going to need help getting the rectal temperature, getting them in the tub, getting them out of the tub if the person's combative or refuses care. So you need other adults who understand what's going to happen with heat stroke. So this is the prevention, recognition, and treatment of heat stroke, and it goes through an actual scenario and a case in there. And it's just 12 minutes long. If you Google NFL Play Smart, Play Safe, you will get to that, or NFL and my name and heat stroke, you will see the video. So again, just another resource. Another resource you can use in educational settings is Stephanie Kuzadem, probably the best sports journalist in the country related to emergencies in sport. She published a paper that Louisville Courier took down the paywall for, so anyone can access. It is like over 50 pages long. She studied every single death in high school sport from 2000 to 2022, and she chronicles every single death, all causes. And did they have an athletic trainer? Did they have an EAP? What states did they happen in? All those kinds of things. So just another great resource if you want to learn more about preventing sudden death in sport, especially at the high school level. So when we're talking about sudden death that happens in high school and college sports, over 90% of all the deaths are basically the four H's. So heart, head meaning brain bleeds, not concussions, heat meaning heat stroke, and hemoglobin meaning sickling related issues. Okay, so it's actually like around 92%. So the other things, like the book that was mentioned earlier that I published, Preventing Sudden Death in Sport and Physical Activity, they cover 18 different ways someone can die. But these four are about 92% of all the deaths. So I would highly recommend that make sure you're absolutely really well versed on those and have great plans in place. And those are all being rehearsed ahead of time. And when you do rehearsals, wherever you work, always encourage three scenarios, especially if you work with a high school. One is there's no athletic trainer there and the athletic trainer will not arrive, meaning they're at an away football game. They're not working that day. So the coach has to provide the care until the ambulance arrives. Second scenario is the athletic trainer's not there at the moment, but they're going to arrive from somewhere else on campus. So it's going to be 2 or 3 minutes, but we don't want to lose 2 or 3 minutes of compressions or getting the AED or getting off clothing or whatever you would do while you're waiting for the athletic trainer to arrive. And the third scenario is the athletic trainer is there when the emergency happens, like at a high school sports field. But obviously, as I mentioned earlier, they're going to need the coaches to assist them. The athletic trainer might start compressions and the coach is grabbing the AED and calling 911. So we got to think about those three scenarios within these four medical conditions at least when we're doing these rehearsals. So I mentioned this temperature to you. This is the highest heat stroke temperature that I ever treated in my career, 112.8. Happened a few years ago. I was a high school lacrosse player running a summer road race. And he was not surprisingly very out of it when we started with him, but just 20 something minutes later, he was back amongst the coherent and communicating with us. So I'll talk more about that outcome and others. But when we talk about policies, you guys are young professionals in the sports medicine world. You need to really be advocates for the states in which you work. So every state has their own sports medicine advisory committee, and every state has a state high school athletic association. So it's not like the NCAA or the NFL where they have a national governing body. So these organizations are things by state level. So policies get passed by either state laws or state high school athletic association. So last year we had 6 deaths, which was the highest year in this century. So we first have to figure out why the heck we having so many heat stroke deaths. But when you take a look at those 6 states, none of them had cold water immersion except Maryland as a requirement, and none of them had cool first transport second. If you look on the right, 16 states require cold water immersion, 13 states require cool first transport second, 32 states require emergency action plans specific to sports venues. Now, many, many other states recommend these, so I'm not saying they don't know the right thing. And then, so require versus recommend, we obviously want to see things be required. And then policy versus implementation, we could have a policy in a state. That doesn't mean people are implementing it. And then also, even if the state doesn't have a policy, it's certainly still the physician and the athletic trainer's responsibility to make sure best practices are being implemented at each school or each setting that you're at. But I mentioned this to you because you guys are going to be the leaders. You're going to be on these sports medicine advisory committees someday, and you guys need to take the lead to make sure your state sports medicine advisory committee, your state laws are really in line with what the best practices are. We can't assume each high school is going to do it on their own because a third of the high schools in America don't even have athletic trainers. All right. So we need to really keep pushing this stuff forward. We made a lot of progress, and I'll share some of that with you. So back in 2012, we kind of took a look at the deaths that we had access to and we had information and try to figure out when and why do heat strokes take place. So first of all, when a heat stroke presents itself, what are the errors in care? Because first of all, I need to share with you, when someone's body temperature is brought under 104 within 30 minutes of presentation, there's 100% survivability with no evidence of long-term complications or permanent complications. So that bottom line for this whole presentation is how do we get people's temperature under 104 within 30 minutes? That's over 3,000 cases we've tracked. We recently last summer published a paper with 460 heat strokes. We think it's the largest data set ever published. And the average start temperature was 108 degrees. So I'm giving you that just as a framework. So for every 106, there's 110s, right? So you might have a 108, 109, 110. So we have to think about how do we get a 110 under 104 within 30 minutes? So that things to help us with that is getting these four things correctly. So when long-term problems happen or death happens, these things go awry, right? Number one, inaccurate temperature assessment or a misdiagnosis. So people are using oral, axillary, temporal, tympanic, all these things that are grossly inaccurate when people are doing intense exercise in the heat. We need to do a rectal temperature. And I'm going to remind you, a rectal temperature is not just for the diagnosis. It's super valuable for the diagnosis because remember, it's not just rule in, it's also rule out. If someone has a CNS dysfunction and you do a rectal and you see it's 102.8, you know that CNS dysfunction is coming from maybe hyponatremia, maybe a head injury, maybe some kind of blood glucose issue, whatever else it might be, it's not heat stroke. Okay, so you can start to figure out the other conditions. So it does help with diagnosis. But remember, the key thing we're using for it in heat stroke is when to take out of the tub. We never want to use subjective measures. The 112.8 I shared with you before, that person was totally coherent with us at 107, talked normally, gave us phone numbers, gave us names, told us all the details, answered every question that we had. Well, we didn't want to remove from the tub at 107 because the critical threshold for cell damage is probably around 105 or a little higher than 105. So we want to always take them well below that. And the best practices is that we start the removal process like when we get under 103. But so keeping all of that in mind, that's why we're doing rectal temp. It's not just the diagnosis. It's we need to know when to take them out of the tub. And there's no human being in the world can look at another human who's been doing intense exercise and suffered a heat stroke and knows what their body temperature is from looking at them. So that's why we do that. Number two, no care or treatment delayed. Think waiting for an ambulance or a complete miss. So we didn't get the temperature. Remember, when you see heat stroke at the time of the incident, they're not going to be on, most likely, they're not going to be completely unconscious. They're going to have some kind of altered consciousness. They're going to maybe be confused, maybe be a little combative, maybe be really lethargic, maybe be slow to respond. So there's going to be something that's off very likely, but they're likely not going to be completely unconscious. When I took my sports medicine classes in the 1980s, we were told heat stroke victims would be completely unconscious and they would have dry skin. Those two things are just not true. They come from the classic heat stroke literature. So you may know classic heat stroke is when like elderly people are left in apartment buildings without air conditioning during heat waves or infants are left in parked cars in the summertime. That's classic heat stroke. That's a failure of the thermoregulatory system. Exertional heat stroke is an overwhelming of the thermoregulatory system, meaning we're generating heat faster than we're able to lose it for an extended period of time. And then that's when we get the extreme hyperthermia. So you will see profuse sweating at the time of incident. You will see people have altered consciousness, but likely not be completely unconscious. All right, so we need to be thinking about that. Third is inefficient cooling modality. Think ice bags on peripheral arteries. That's not the modality of choice. Okay, you want to cover as much of the skin surface area with freezing cold water. So that could be cold, wet towels if that's all you have. If you have a cooler filled with ice water and towels, that might be your modality you have at some cross-country practice or some remote setting or a JV soccer field. But if you have a high school or college or pro football practice and you have water, you have a tub, and you have ice. You should have a cold water immersion tub set up because that is definitely, without question, has the fastest cooling rates, which we'll talk about. And then the other thing is an error is immediate transport. That's where the concept comes from: cool first, transport second, because there's just too many minutes. If we wait for an ambulance to come. The ambulance is on site. Then we wait for the ambulance to go back to the hospital. Then the hospital has to do their onboarding, and then they have to get cooling ready. That we're looking at 45 minutes or an hour in the best case scenario. Whereas if we cool on site, we could have them in a tub within 3 minutes of a collapse from a heat stroke. And we obviously, if cooling rate is generally a smaller runner might be in for 15, 16, 17 minutes to go from 108 to 103, and a big football player might be 25 to 30 minutes. But it gives you an idea that we can accomplish this goal. All right, so this is a really important slide. So I'm going to review these four things. The keys to treating heat stroke correctly, right, is the key part of the whole talk. So if you're going to go have dinner or do something else, just focus for 1 second. One is recognizing the possibility of exertional heat stroke as fast as humanly possible, meaning you go out to the person, cardiac function is okay. You know they don't have sickle cell trait. They didn't have a head injury. So you're thinking that it could be heat stroke as fast as possible. Number two, you're getting an accurate measure for core body temperature, which needs to be a rectal temperature. Third, we're using the most effective cooling modality we can possibly use given the circumstances. So if we can be prepared, it'd be cold water immersion, but there might be rotating cold wet towels. It might be using a shower from a locker room when it happens during a wrestling practice in the wintertime. We just want cold, freezing cold water on as much of the skin surface area as possible. Fourth is cool first, transport second. Finish the cooling before you transport the person. Okay, so that's all the stuff where errors will happen. People die or have long-term problems related to the care of heat stroke. But we have to also understand what caused the heat stroke in the first place. Okay, so we have to parse out the causing of heat stroke is very different than the treatment of heat stroke. You could mess everything up and cause a heat stroke for somebody, but you still can save their life without incident. Okay. But what causes it in the first place? It'd be great to reduce the incidence of heat stroke and not have them in the first place. And these are common things that you've been taught already. One is hydration. During intense exercise in the heat, body temperature is closely related to dehydration status. Heat acclimatization is very, very helpful. Almost all of our heat deaths happen in the first week, especially the first few days. Modifying the practice intensity and duration based on the wet bulb globe temperature. So more rest breaks and longer rest breaks when it's more extreme environmental conditions. But all those three things, you've heard of those things already, and those are important. We always want you to focus on them. But probably the most important item is number four. We continue in America at high school, college, youth sports. We continue to have workouts that are completely inappropriate for the person doing the workout. So let's cover a few stats first. The leading sport for heat stroke by far in America in high school and college sports is football. Okay? Over 90% of them are football. Next, within football, the only position in high school football that has had a person die since 1995 has been lineman. Okay? Now, other people have had heat strokes, but in terms of the deaths, and at least the ones we've tracked, they've been linemen. So that tells us something, right? If linemen are the people who are heating up faster, having these heat stroke deaths, we're probably doing something really wrong with how we train linemen. So linemen should not be doing the same workouts as receivers and linebackers and running backs. They heat up much faster. The demands of their sport are very, very different than those other positions. So their conditioning should be dramatically different. So we need to be working with coaches and holding coaches accountable and athletic directors accountable and strength and conditioning coaches accountable. And as a physician and athletic trainer, we need to make sure to be monitoring if workouts are appropriate, if they're matched to the conditioning level and appropriate for the sport and position in which they're playing. I'm going to have you take a second to read that. So in the lawsuits that I've been involved with, this is probably the most important quote. And the reason for this is that there's a certain expectation that if you're going to host in a high school or college, you're going to host a sports program, there's expectations now for health and safety, that it's going to be competently rendered. So that's basically means like you're going to deliver best practices. Okay. And a cardiac event happens, we're going to get an AED. Heat stroke happens, we're going to cool the person, things like that. Okay. And an ordinary care standard, and it does not appear to be unduly burdensome. Okay, so that the expectation is we'll deliver this care if we're going to be hosting the sports program. So this is just an example of things that you would see on the back end if one of the athletes you have has a permanent problem or there's a death. So I'm going to give you a couple quick case studies. I am going to try to end by about 9:20 or just past that so that we have time for questions. So this is, like I said, a very abbreviated version, but I do think I'm not going to have time for all these. I'm going to spend time with just a couple. One was the Max Gilpin case. You may or may not have heard of this. It's the first criminal case in America for a coach for their role in an exertional heat stroke case. Okay, it's a really interesting case. We published a research paper on this. It was all publicly accessible files from the trial. So we thought the health sports medicine community would benefit from this. This is the timeline of events, and you see the heat stroke happen somewhere in this range. And you see at the hospital did deliver outstanding care, but so many minutes had passed. By the time we're down in the 105 range, say we're at 7:30. So we have the ballpark of, 80 minutes, say, that the person is Max Gilpin's extremely hyperthermic. Not surprising, he passed away. These are the temperatures at the hospital right there. Okay, those are the accurate temperatures. This is my prediction based on the no cooling that they did and the time that passed and passive cooling rates sitting in the sun. And this is what could have happened if Max went in cold water immersion. This is standard cooling rates for a big person. And it shows you he could have been down in the 104 range in probably around 20, 22 minutes. Okay, so that's just one example. You could read that publication and learn a lot about a particular case. It's a good educational tool. We also did two really good case studies with Hunter Knighton and Gavin Class. They both gave permission. Thankfully, they both survived, but they both took more than 2 years to recover from their heat stroke. Okay. Gavin Class lost over 100 pounds in the 3 months he was in the hospital, had over 25 surgeries and a liver transplant. Okay. That's him on the right side. He was a football player at Towson State University. Hunter Knighton was a football player at the University of Miami. So let's go back to those four items that I mentioned to you earlier. Okay, so recognizing heat stroke as fast as humanly possible, getting an accurate core body temperature, using an extremely effective cooling modality, and doing cool first, transport second. So in the Towson State case, they did number 1 and 3. They recognized heat stroke right away, and they got him in a cold water immersion tub within a few minutes. The problem was they didn't have a rectal temperature. So when the ambulance came, they really didn't have a temperature to verify to keep cooling, and they didn't do cool first, transport second. So he's still over 108 over an hour later at the hospital. So they did 1 and 3, didn't do 2 and 4. He had a 2 year recovery, super lucky to survive. I do think the 4 or 5 minutes in the tub did save his life because it did get the cooling started at least, but obviously he would have been fine that night or the next morning if he had stayed in the tub for another 15 or 20 minutes. Hunter Knighton, his care involved zero of those four. Okay. There was absolutely nothing done to help him related to his heat stroke until he got to the hospital later. All right, so these are just two great case studies. Both of them have had specials on ESPN, on Outside the Lines, both but very public. We published our heat acclimatization process with them coming back and their heat tolerance testing we did that came every 3 months to us at KSI. We have an athlete come about every week or a laborer from around the country and world where we help them figure out how they can get back to their sport and job after they've had a heat stroke and were not treated properly and have had problems with recovery. That's Gavin at his wedding ceremony just a little over 2 years ago. So it's been 10 years. We've had the good fortune of interacting with him and developed a great friendship. You guys are probably aware of the case study of Jordan McNair. This is more recent, 2018. This is a document produced from Walters Incorporated. It's a 100-page document that this company produced, hired by the University of Maryland. But the bottom line is similar to all the other case studies that I'm sharing. He started struggling on the field at 4:53. Okay. He gets into the athletic training room around 5:26. He is not arriving at the hospital till 6:36. So that does not mean his temperature's starting to come down yet. That's his arrival. So he's maybe looking at 7 o'clock or 6:50 by the time his temperature is getting under the critical threshold for cell damage. And so you get an idea, massive amount of time, probably 2 hours above the threshold where he started struggling here and he could have been under, somewhere in this range. He was in a facility and they chose not to put him in an immersion tub in the athletic training room because he was fearful that he would drown. And that is outlined in here. Okay. So this is from the Walters report from interviews that they conducted. I was also an expert witness on that case and do know that case quite well. I was an expert witness on the Max Gilpin one as well. This is Jordan McNair's dad, who now comes to the Falmouth road race with us every year. I do encourage anybody who's on this Zoom to come to the Falmouth road race next year in 2026. We have about 50 guests who come every year to learn about heat stroke. We average about 15 to 20 heat strokes a year here. It's a great place to learn. I always tell people the next heat stroke you care for might be the first heat stroke you care for. I do encourage you to Find a race near you if you can't come to the Falmouth Road Race, like Peachtree Road Race on July 4th every year, or any kind of late spring, summer, early fall race, especially things like 10K, 12Ks, 10 milers, half marathons, sprint and Olympic distance triathlons, things that are less than like 90 minutes in the summertime, like 30 to 90-minute range, you're going to see your greatest incidence of heat stroke. So just some best practice documents. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but in 2012, we did a best practice document to try to help collegiate athletes not die during conditioning sessions. Scott Anderson was a huge part of this process, and myself and some others, and a lot of AMSSM members were involved with this. Unfortunately, the NCAA did not endorse this in 2012, even though they participated. Then finally, 7 years later, 2019, we plagiarized that 2012 document and then did it again. This time the NCAA was involved, and we had, again, a whole bunch of organizations now endorse it, and now the NCAA endorsed it. It does say recommended, not required, but it is a huge step forward from the NCAA perspective and does give the best practices and all the things that we've been recommending. So it is a document, if you work at the college level, I would highly encourage you to look at. Similarly, at the high school level, preventing sudden death at the high school level, we published this in 2013 to try to have establish some best practices for people to follow. This covers the 4 H's: strength and conditioning sessions, athletic training services, and emergency action plans. Those 7 items are the key factors covered. I do want to remind you the leading months for heat stroke in America are July and August. That is not going to surprise any of you, but it is important to understand July is the second most common month for death, and we have no schools taking place in America in July, but we have a ton of conditioning sessions, captain's practices, and a lot of less regulation in July. And a lot of times athletic trainers are not working, so we really need to keep our eye on that month. So when we're talking about prevention, I'm not going to spend as much time here. There was improvements and enhancements to best practice policies from the 2013 document. Again, I'm trying to give you resources. So in 2021, ACSM and NATA got together and published updates related to WBGT, updates related to heat acclimatization, updates related to the care of heat stroke. All right, so that's some new best practice documents that are written by physicians and athletic trainers. So you're well aware of what HEDAC is, the phasing in of activity over time. We do see great physiological changes. About 4 to 5 days in, we probably see about 75% of it. About 7 to 10 days in, about maybe 90%. 2 weeks in, maybe 95 to 100%. So really want to protect people in that first week. Okay. 2009, we did a document that basically plagiarized the NCAA policies back from 2003 when they adopted heat acclimatization guidelines for college football. We tried to move forward with this for high school football. And at that time, no states had best practices in place for heat acclimatization. And now we're very happy to see that over 30 states now meet best practices for heat acclimatization. Data really supports the benefit of that. About 55% reduction in heat illnesses in states that have adopted heat acclimatization policies, which is very powerful when you think that heat acclimatization costs no money. It's just making modifications to practice strategies. The state of Georgia is the #1 state in America right now with the number of health and safety policies for high school sport. Georgia and Florida are far and away the top two. Give them a lot of credit, being very proactive with trying to get the right policies in place. They did do it in response to a lot of deaths that they've had in their state, but at least they made positive changes in response to those tragedies. I also want to give credit to states like New Hampshire, Vermont, New Jersey. They did the big changes, even though they didn't have deaths preceding the policy changes. So they were proactive even before the death occurred. So look at this though. When the wet bulb globe temperature is in the most common region for Georgia when they're practicing, which is this one, they had an 80% reduction in heat illnesses by adopting wet bulb globe temperature policies. So specific policies that are right here, sorry, use very specific wet bulb globe temperatures, and they have very specific number of rest breaks and the length of rest breaks based on the wet bulb globe temperature. So taking it out of each high school hands, because as you all know, not every high school in America has a thermal physiologist. So each high school would really not be prepared to establish the proper guidelines because they wouldn't know what they are. So we help them using data. So I have to give credit to the executive director at the time in 2012 was Ralph Swernigan, the executive director of the State High School Athletics Association in Georgia. In 2005, they had a heat stroke death, and they passed a state law that every high school had to adopt a heat index policy. Some of the high schools were very sarcastic because there was no guardrails. And so some schools set 150 degrees as the when they would make modifications. So they were doing it super sarcastic. They would know they'd never have to make modifications. Ralph Swernigan knew they would not be successful. So he started collecting data in 2006 for 4 years, got 50 athletic trainers to collect data on the wet bulb globe temperature at every practice when they did and when they did not have heat illnesses. And so he had 4 years of data. So then in 2011, DJ Searcy and Forrest Jones died from heat stroke in Georgia, and Ralph Swernigan now took things into his own hands, convened the meeting that set all these new policies in place, but then had the wisdom to continue to collect data for 3 more years so that we could have the pre-post data. So we would never have this data if we didn't have the data before and after. This is the data from the 4 years before and the 3 years after the policy. So we had some really good pre and post data. So that was helpful. They also found out that almost all the heat illnesses take place in the first 2 hours of practice. Okay, so Ralph Swernigan in the first, he changed the rule. In the first week, no practice could be longer than 2 hours, and you also couldn't have any gear on in the first week. So he just said the first week's just going to be heat acclimatization week, and we're going to just protect people. Um, to their credit, they have not had a heat stroke death in football in these timeframes, like the first couple of weeks of practice when people start football. They have had issues, in conditioning sessions, and they had a death in a high school female basketball player. But specific to the high school football, it has certainly seemed to be helping. Also, look, 75% of all the heat illnesses basically are in the first 10 days. This is the entire season this percent is based on. So it's like 120 days, and almost everything happens in the first 10 days. So let's just try to be more proactive. This is data we had from Falmouth Road Race. Look at this is heat stroke up here, and this is heat illness on the bottom. Heat stroke is very closely tied with the wet bulb globe temperature. So it just shows you that obviously the environmental conditions, especially wet bulb globe temperature. You may or may not know when heat index was developed 60 years ago, it was developed specifically for use in the shade for people in t-shirt and shorts who were walking. It was not meant to be in the sun. It was not meant to be during intense activity, and it was not meant if you have gear on. So anytime we're using heat index, it's not appropriate for the circumstances, for instance, of football or a military person training or a laborer
It's still
doing
listening.
work in the heat. All right.
Yeah,
So
yeah, I'm
next,
good.
we have someone that's not muted. Um, I wanted to just show you this also from a prevention perspective. The hottest state in America for wet bulb globe temperature in the summertime is Louisiana. It might have been your guess, but here you can see the data. Obviously, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, super, super close. I show this to you because at the time we published this, um, about 5 years ago, this is the number of policies that each state had out of 20. So things like heat act, hydration stuff, wet bulb globe temperature, cold water immersion. Louisiana, for instance, had 0 out of 20. You can see Georgia was very proactive. But so what we did, and you can do this in any model, in any health model, you could use this for cardiac, head injuries, but we did it for heat because obviously that's our focus. And here you can see Louisiana is in the problem quadrant, right? Because it's the hottest state, but it had 0 policies. So we obviously was the worst situation. Whereas an example is New Jersey it's moderately hot, but they had all the policies. So they were in a proactive quadrant here. But Louisiana now has every single policy, and Georgia now has every one. Vermont has them. New Hampshire, New Jersey, Florida, all are up here with all of them, which we're very happy to see. But Louisiana did it in response to 4 kids dying from heat stroke in football. And Louisiana is a relatively small state in the grand scheme of things. So it gives you an idea of a lot of people do the big changes after they have the deaths. Obviously, we'd love to see them before the deaths take place. I want to just acquaint you quickly with 4 big public health initiatives we do at KSI. There's probably connectivity for what you do in your job and what we're doing. So I wanted to mention them quickly. Atlas is our effort to keep track of athletic training services in all 21,000 high schools. We partner closely with the NATA, but we help keep track of that. So we have a real-time database at our website. You can track any high school, see who the athletic trainer is, but we use the data to help us figure out why high schools don't have it, rural and urban issues, socioeconomic issues, different things like that. So we've published over 10 papers from Atlas data to try to better understand that, because obviously we'd love to see every high school have an athletic trainer. Tufts is our effort to enhance health and safety standards for high school sport. We've visited 46 states so far. We've done 75 visits because a lot of states we've gone to 2 or 3 times. over the last 5 years. I'm very proud to report we have had made 463 policy changes so far in the 5 years from the Tufts visits, and this is supported by the NATA and the NFL. Innovate is a $6 million of funding to get athletic trainers in traditionally underserved communities. So we've now penetrated over 20 school districts in America that never had athletic trainers before and helps them develop systems to have long-term sustainability. You may have heard of NCCSIR. It's housed in UNC Chapel Hill, but we partner closely with the University of Washington, and us here at KSI, we partner with them. And we investigate every single death that happens in America in youth, high school, college, and professional sport. Everyone is investigated, and KSI is involved in all the non-cardiac exertional deaths, so things like sickling and heat stroke. So those big public health initiatives, about 40 of our staff members at KSI, this is what they do on a daily basis. This is an idea of some of the states we visited so far. I don't know if this is like the most updated. It might be from like a month or two ago. But you can see we have 5 states we've not been to because it's 51 altogether with District of Columbia. Some states we're going back to again. We're going back to Ohio again because they're very eager to try to make some changes. We're going to go back to Minnesota. We're going back to New York again. But these five are all scheduled for the next 6 months. This is an idea of some of the changes that states have made related to these policies. This is not updated because we just got a new calculation that there's 463 now. Because we just did our newest update a month ago. So this is from a couple months ago. So that was exciting. You're seeing a lot of momentum. It was harder to get people started, but in the last couple months, especially the last couple years, there's a lot of momentum now that people see that people can handle this. I'll give you an example here. This is the most current policy evaluation. Now it's going to be updated, I think, in 2 days because we release our evaluation every August. So this is out of a 100-point rubric. And it has like 20 points for cardiac, 20 points for head, it has 20 for heat, stuff for emergency action plans, athletic training services. So it gives you an idea. I mentioned to you before, Georgia and Florida do quite well. Vermont just added a ton of stuff, so they're going to be moving into the 6th spot. California, thankfully, added over 20 points worth of policies, which I'll mention a couple of them in a second. So we've made a lot of momentum with these changes. So just to give you an idea, when we started, we didn't have anybody like in the 80s and 90s, and most states were in the 30s and 40s, and now we're seeing a lot of states in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We're also working closely with the NFL and the Smart Heart Sports Coalition. This happened following the Damar Hamlin incident, where we're working together for EAPs, AED access, and coaching education for CPR and AED. So this is their map. The ones in green are all three. And then yellow have two, and so on and so forth. So this is not the most updated one either. This is from a few months ago. So this is very similar efforts to Tufts, so they very much overlap each other. So just an example of some big things that have happened. California added in coaching education. They also added in emergency action plans specific to sport, which was massive, but we also fought really hard to have it be also rehearsed, required to be rehearsed, not just shared. They also finally added regulation for the athletic training profession. It was the only state in America that did not have regulation for the athletic training profession. So my wife and my 3 children, who none of our athletic trainers, until last year, they all could have been athletic trainers in the state of California. There was absolutely no regulation. But thankfully now there is. And we had 3 different Tufts meetings in California and worked really hard and assisted the state who worked their butts off to make that happen. This is just some big publications that came out last summer. This is a 40-year report for all the heat stroke deaths that have happened in high school sport. Not surprisingly, you're seeing the months they took place. This is the year blocks. This next 5-year block is going to be the worst ever, probably, or it's going to rival this other one, which is just such a shame because we have all this great information for best practices and we have a lot of lives being saved. But as I said before, we're not preventing the heat strokes from happening in the first place because we're doing a horrendous job of really confronting coaches and strength and conditioning coaches when they do inappropriate workouts. All right, I mentioned to you before the positions when it comes to heat stroke and sickling, at least on all the data we have, at the high school level specifically, all of them have been linemen so far, so that's important information. This is a really important publication because the National Association of EMS Physicians endorsed this, and they now use it if you're going to do board certification as to be an EMS physician. They actually use this document as one of the required readings, and it's really important because this is advocating for on-site cooling and cool first, transport second. It's super valuable because in the sports medicine world, athletic trainers know how to care for heat stroke. Sports medicine physicians know how to care for heat stroke. But when the ambulance services come and when they get to the hospital, a lot of times there's a disconnect because they're not following best practices for exertional heat stroke. So this is really a big step forward. I give them a lot of credit. This is just some other big documents that have come out recently. I'm going to go about 2 more minutes. Really important to be aware of. A couple of your members were authors on this. This came out last year. I think it's the best position statement ever published. Dr. Scarnio Miller led this. She's now a professor at Old Dominion University. And you can see the other co-authors there, but this is the most current document really related to emergency action plans in the sports setting. So I highly encourage you to get your hands on that. This is our most current heat on this position statement from NATA back from 2015. I worked with Ron Corson and some of your members worked on this of really trying to get the word out about having a pre-event medical meeting with the key people to make sure you talk through things before emergencies happen. I mentioned to you the International Olympic Committee had some amazing publications, and I'm going to tell you about two of them right now. I would recommend getting your hands on these. I will share these PDFs with your supervisors. But this was I think the best article ever written for heat stroke, and it has the best equipment list, the best algorithms. And if you're new to the heat stroke world or you're interacting with people who are new, I really recommend this. This is one of the best algorithms ever done. They have algorithms that lead you to a heat stroke algorithm and then a heat stroke algorithm. And it's a really well done, came out a couple years ago. But then this article is if you're hosting an event in the heat, this is about all of the planning to host an event in the heat. It's not just about heat stroke. It's about everything to do health and safety for your spectators, your volunteers, your participants, and all the things related to body cooling, heat acclimatization, hydration, everything if you're hosting an event in the heat. This was endorsed by the International Olympic Committee, as was this document here. And they both emanated from our special work group from the Tokyo 2021 Olympic Games. And credit goes to these two lead authors. I just want to definitely do the shout out because they're the people who did the really heavy lifting. So I just wanted to mention that. All right. So wrapping up on a couple just key items to finish. And there's one last slide I want to show you guys. And I think I did pretty good here. I'm reiterating hot, dry skin, huge myth. Okay. If you're there at the time of the incident, they're going to be heavily sweating, most likely. And also, you've heard people in the past say don't cool them too quickly. That's like the worst information you could have ever shared. Cool people as fast as humanly possible. Rotating freezing cold, wet water over as much of the skin surface area is the best way to cool someone. I'm reminding you, heat stroke, we get the body temperature because we expect severe hypothermia at the time of incident and we expect some kind of CNS dysfunction. There's massive overlap on signs and symptoms of heat stroke with other conditions. And I don't even have head injuries here. Okay, so we could have CNS dysfunction in a lot of different conditions, but we don't have severe hypothermia at the time of incident, except in heat stroke. So heat stroke combining CNS and severe hypothermia helps you really rule it in. But the rectal temp is also super important to rule out heat stroke and then immediately start thinking I'm dealing with some other emergency right now and not wasting your time. Okay, so again, we're ruling in and out heat stroke, but we're also when to stop cooling. That temperature is critical. I'm going to give you a couple quick articles. Military published this. There was 3 cases of severe hyponatremia that had really bad outcomes, and all 3 of them people thought it was heat stroke, and no one did a rectal temperature. If they'd done rectal temp, they would have known it wasn't a heat stroke. And they didn't do rectal temperature initially, but later they got rectal temps and they realized that they lost a lot of valuable time for the hyponatremia. Similarly, we published this paper a few years ago, and these were cases related to sickle cell trait. And people thought it was heat stroke originally, and again, didn't get a body temperature where they would have ruled out heat stroke and started thinking about something else. So I'm just trying to give it some examples. The NCA document from 2019 strongly recommends using core body temperature via rectal thermometry. All right. I don't have time to get through all the rest of these, but I think you do have access to this slide presentation. I am going to just show you one thing. Sorry. You're like, this is crazy, Casa. Were we really expecting to go through all of this? So combative patients, this is in your document here. I published a chapter back in 2015 with 10 different combative patients and weird scenarios, like person tried to drown themselves in the tub, person escaped the tub, literally escaped, ran 100 meters, and we had to get him back to the tub. Another person bit one of the providers It caused a lot of damage during the biting because they were so combative. Another person gave us a debate on why we shouldn't do rectal temperature. These are just examples. You got to be ready for people to be acting crazy while you're treating the heat stroke. I don't have time to go through all those, but I wanted you to see that. I'm going to end with just this slide right here, my last slide. So I did pretty good. It's 9:25. This is just my take-home message of why we're working to cool people fast on site with the best modality. So let's just look at this quick. Heat stroke survivals and fatalities, okay? So if they get adequate cooling, so that's greater than 0.15 degrees Celsius per minute, that's what we defined it as. So that would be like burrito method, taco method, rotating cold wet towels over the whole body, dousing with a cold shower, dousing with cold water over the whole body, things like that. Obviously, we prefer cold water immersion because those others are about 2/3 as effective, but those could fall in this category. 378 survived, no deaths. Then survive versus fatalities for inefficient cooling. So they don't all die. Only 1/6 of them die, and 1/7 of them die. So that's still horrible odds. You still wouldn't want that. But I'm telling you, they're not going to all die with insufficient cooling. But the key part is over here. When people survive, 346 survived with no problems. That's all after the acute care. Four had long-term problems. Okay. When they don't get sufficient cooling, 32 of them survive without problems, and 116 of them have long-term or permanent complications. So sometimes, because the media always focuses on the deaths from heat stroke, you lose sight of the fact that people never go back to their sport. A lot of people never go back to their job. People have permanent dialysis. People have permanent cognitive problems. I dealt with a lady in Cal State San Bernardino. You can look up the case, Marissa Freeman, big trial, $39 million settlement. And she can't use her arms and her legs. She can use a couple fingers. Okay. And that for her was a physical. Some people it's just cognitive. Some people it's just liver. Some people it's just kidney. Some people it's a mixture. All right. So our goal is to recognize it quickly, cool them down with the best modality, cool them down on site so that we try to maximize our chances of being in this category of survivors and this category of no long-term issues. And that is my finish line.
Thank you, Dr. Casa, for such a great
Yes.
talk. Sorry. All right. And we have about 3 minutes. I don't see any questions right now. And, a quick question I have, or not a quick question, it could be probably like another talk itself. But in terms of the return to play after suffering from heat stroke or heat illnesses for the athletes or other
Yes.
populations, is there anything that you could comment on? Because those are
Yes.
something that we could get tested on as well. And it's something that we should also know as a physician. So
Yes, so I'd say the best document right now is the most current ACSM position statement on heat illness. The last portion of that paper, Fran O'Connor wrote the section on return to play following heat stroke, and that is probably the most comprehensive document that exists right now. There are some other good ones. If you Google return to play following heat stroke, it's obviously not, you can't really do a clinical study on this, right? You're not going to induce heat stroke and then have different regimens for people after. So that's why I showed you that paper just now that Erica Philippe published that we did to just give you an idea of what happens long term if they have good care or not good care. If someone has amazingly good care, cooled rapidly, has no issues, I'd recommend them doing a week of nothing, no sports, no activity, see their physician, and then start ramping up light activity in climate controlled facility for another week or two, and then slowly introducing heat. But make sure you get the fitness back first. Always remember, fitness is the most important thing that influences our exercise heat tolerance. Fitness is more important than heat AC, more important than hydration, anything. So get fit first is what we tell people. So spend a couple weeks in climate control facility, get fit first, then start introducing low intensity activity outside. Okay. If they're not cooled properly, you might have to do heat tolerance testing. You might be looking at 6 months to a year. For some people, they'll never return to their sport or their job. But I also remind you, regardless of the care, you have to take a look at why did the heat stroke happen in the first place so you don't have it happen again, right? One, it might be intrinsic. There might be medications they're on, medical conditions they have. They might be overweight, out of shape. That might be because the coaches, as I mentioned, do very poor workouts that are not appropriate. So we have to take a close look at that. Can it be modified before they return so that we might alter the trajectory of it happening again the next time? Okay, so keep that in mind. It's not just the physical recovery, it's also optimizing their situation. Because remember, when they go back, their teammates are more heat acclimatized, their teammates are more fit. because this person's now been out for a couple weeks, right? So we really have to try to protect them in that scenario. Is that helpful?
Yes,
All right.
very helpful. Thank you. A couple questions I have. So one is, would you recommend running cold saline in tank when doing the
I
rapid
would
cooling?
not. I don't think that's needed at all. I mean, if I had a remote laborer who had a heat stroke and they were in an ambulance, I would consider a cold saline there, or in a situation in a hospital if I don't have other cooling modalities. But the cooling rate of cold saline is nowhere near what you would get with cold water immersion. It would not be appropriate. Okay. Cold water immersion in the Celsius realm, if it's done just adequate, not great, is 0.25 degrees Celsius per minute, which is 8 times faster than passive cooling in the shade. And so 0.25 degrees Celsius per minute. And that's just with rotating the water pretty well, almost the whole body in, pretty cold water. There's been evidence of 0.35 when it's freezing cold water, the whole body in an aggressive circulation. So that means you could get someone from 110 down to like 103 for like a runner, like in 15 minutes.
Seems like the question was actually about whether to use saline in a cold water immersion bath or not.
You
Sorry.
could consider that. I just don't think it's necessary at all. Cold water immersion gives such incredible cooling rates. It's in the medical literature, there's nothing that comes close to the cooling rates of cold water immersion. I know it's not feasible in every circumstance, and I tell people have a cooler filled with ice water and towels and cover the whole body with freezing cold wet towels. That might be your JV soccer field down the road. It might be your cross country coach taking that to a park where they do their practices. It might be a dual cross country meet at a park. Like I said before, you might have a wrestling heat stroke in the middle of the winter. You don't have an immersion tub ready to go. So take them into the locker room with cold water and have them just be doused with cold water for 15 or 20 minutes. So the biggest thing is, do you have a plan? You need to have a plan for each practice, each sport scenario if a heat stroke happens.
Okay. And the other question, based on the talk, probably check the temp, but some of them says some of the ATCs recommend rapid cooling even when the rectal temp is not checked when they suspect a heat stroke clinically. Would you recommend this or check temp first? I'm assuming check temp first and
Always,
then
yes.
duck
So
them.
I tell people this is what I recommend athletic trainers do. If they suspect it's a heat stroke, bring them to the sideline where their easy up tent is and where their tub is. Take off all their clothing, obviously, except their, compression shorts or something. Prop their legs and put some freezing cold wet towels on their body. If the person is not doing better in 3 or 4 minutes, you're not dealing with a heat exhaustion, right? But at least you did all of the things to get the system going in the right direction. Their clothes are off, they're near the tub, you have already started the cooling process. Then I would roll them over, I'd get their rectal temp, and I put them in the tub. Remember, you want to use a thermistor, not a regular thermometer, because you want a flexible thermistor so you can keep it in during the whole time that you're cooling them. Athletic trainers, it's part of our competencies in our profession to do rectal temperature. And athletic trainers tell us, oh, the superintendents don't let us do it or other stuff. They'll lose their licensure if they follow what the superintendent tells them what to do. They have to follow medical best practices. Um, I have worked 40 athletic cases, 30 of them at the high school level, and the high school's lost every single case of heat stroke. Okay. So it's the athletic trainer needs to make sure they have the best practice in place, regardless of what the state policies are. And you, as the physicians and the best sports medicine physicians in the world, or AMSSM physicians, you need to be pushing your ATs to doing the right thing, and you need to be supporting them with their athletic director, with their principal, with their risk manager, and with their superintendent in the school district, and sit in on those meetings. And if you have any difficulty, call up KSI. We've done hundreds of these meetings where people sit in a conference room in January and set up their heat stroke policies with the leadership in the districts, and we help educate them on adopting best practices.
Great. I know we already passed 9:30, so I want to respect everybody's time, but thank you again, Dr. Casa, for amazing lecture. That was awesome. And thank you everyone for joining. Uh,
All right. I
and have a
appreciate the
great night.
opportunity, guys. Reach out to KSI, use our website if you need anything.
Will do. Thank you so much.
All right. See you later.